Hi again, and thank you for your contribution to my Patreon account. You are watching this video because you have decided to support my work, and I'm truly honored and excited to have you as my patron. Each new patron reinforces my belief that helping you engage with art is an important and valuable endeavor. And I want to thank you for your trust. And now, let's go back to the crucifixion that Van Eyck painted around 1420 on a wood panel and which is now on display at the Met. If you have not done so, I suggest that you first watch part 1 of this presentation. You will find it either here on my Patreon page or on my YouTube channel, WithART. If you have seen part 1, you remember that we looked at the way the surface of the panel was organized in horizontal registers, connecting verticals and strong dynamic diagonals. We are now going to look at this spatial organization. In my opinion, spatial organization is one of the most endearing aspects of the painting. Van Eyck applies two different concepts of space. One is bidimensional and includes the whole scene with all the figures. The other one is clearly three-dimensional and is manifest in the distant landscape. You remember that when we first looked at our three main registers, we saw them as stacked up rows, parallel to the panel plane, therefore strictly two-dimensional. But we can also interpret them as three major distinct planes. However, if we isolate the figures from the three planes of the scene, we see that there is no significant differences in sizes between them. And yet, considering the distance between the characters, we would expect to see their size noticeably recede as they stand closer to the cross. That is because although the painter wants us to believe that we are looking at a scene in three dimensions, he represented only on one plane. We could also assume that we are getting a bird's eye view of the whole scene and landscape, which in a way would be correct. However, if you look at all the characters from Jesus to the women below, they are all seen as if you were facing them at eye level, and that makes no geometrical or physical sense. One more spatial inconsistency. Look at the size of some of the characters. We see smaller characters partially peeking between the horsemen. These random heads are not in scale. They may be servants or foot soldiers, but they seem to be placed here only as space fillers. They effectively add to the illusion of crowd, but with no regard for reality or the logic of the painting. This is what Van Eyck didn't do. Here we have the full-page miniature from an anonymous Dutch manuscript. It features the entrance of Jesus in Jerusalem. Spend a little time looking at it and see how this artist's approach to space differs from Van Eyck's. Focus more particularly on the crowd. Granted, the painting skills do not equal Van Eyck's by far, there's a real effort to create a convincing 3D illusion in the layout and scaling of the characters. If Van Eyck had applied this principle to his painting, here is how he would have arranged his characters. But this is what Van Eyck did instead. And this is also where he shows his genius in this early painting. Let's look at the main scene. Although the characters are of equal size and are distributed on one single vertical plane, we do understand that they exist and move in three dimensions. Take some time to look at the horsemen. Pay attention to the way they are placed on that hilltop in relation to each other and to the crosses, especially in relation to the central cross. Pause the video if you want to explore for yourself before hearing what I have to say about this. If we read the scene from left to right, we see that the first horsemen are just entering the frame of the painting. We see the first one in profile, then we see their back. They move up and away from us. Although they stay the same size, it is very clear that they are moving towards the cross. The last horse is just about to leave the frame of the painting while the rider turns around back to the center of the scene, looking up in surprise. The horsemen on the right of the painting are looking towards the left, and then they are facing us. This suggests a march of horsemen circling the cross. Those who have arrived are behind or at the foot of the cross and stretched out all the way to the left of the cross. This motion up and around the crosses creates the illusion of a movement in space without perspective. This moving circle of horsemen comes in stark contrast with the isolation of Jesus on the cross. They are moving, he is still. They are colorful, he is pale. They seem to be there to show that there is no way out for Jesus. Now, let's look at the city. Let's compare Van Eyck's rendition of buildings to this mural painted in 1425 by Italian painter Masaccio. Masaccio is Van Eyck's contemporary and known as the first painter to master linear perspective. Linear perspective was invented around 1420 in Florence, and this mural is one of its first applications. Masaccio's mural features the story of the tribute money. All the parallel lines of that building are following the orthogonal lines in the painting. And when these orthogonal lines converge at the vanishing point on the horizon, the illusion of a third dimension is created. This is called one-point linear perspective. One side of the building is facing us, and we understand that the other side is facing left and that the two sides meet at right angle. Now, if we look at Van Eyck's building, we notice that the two sides are facing us and that the only thing that really suggests the third dimension is the shading. The light comes from the left and the right side is darker on some of the buildings. You may think that Van Eyck didn't use perspective because the buildings are so far away that it doesn't matter anyway, and that is a valid observation. However, a few years later, he painted this Annunciation. We see that although he probably understood the principle of one-point perspective, he still didn't use it consistently in the entire painting. There are at least 3 vanishing points and 3 horizon lines in this painting, and even without the orthogonal lines, you can tell that the space is not quite right. This is actually called empirical perspective. Van Eyck does achieve a convincing illusion of depth, but the walls, floor, and ceiling don't appear perpendicular because the artist didn't apply the first rule of linear perspective. There is only one horizon, and all vanishing points should be set on it. So, Van Eyck is not interested in the accurate application of linear perspective in rendering architecture. But let's go back to the landscape as a whole. Look how the buildings recede in the distance, first within the city and then the countryside. There are castles, villages, windmills on those hills, almost as far as the eye can see. Notice how the river recedes in the distance. Although those very distant buildings are not in scale, here the illusion of space and distance is more convincing than in the main scene. And that is due to Van Eyck's groundbreaking innovation, the use of color. First of all, The colors that we see beyond the hills in the city are a lot less varied and bright than in the main scene. Then, as you move further in the distance, the warm brown, oranges, and ochres turn grayish-green. Then, from a variety of greens, Van Eyck gradually switches to a middle blue. Then, in the distance, to a very pale blue that makes the mountain fade into the sky. Colors from the crowd to the mountains in the distance become cooler and are gradually desaturated to create the illusion of a great distance. This technique is called atmospheric perspective. No one before Van Eyck had ever been able to render distance using subtle changes in colors and light with such sensitivity to the real world. With this particular landscape, Van Eyck introduces a groundbreaking phenomenon in art. He observes nature in order to render it faithfully on the panel. What does that mean? But that means that Van Eyck probably went outside, looked around, paid attention to colors and light, and tried to transfer what he saw onto his canvas as accurately as possible. How groundbreaking was that in the 1420s, you may ask? Well, let's compare to some of the greatest Italian artists who worked in the 1420s and 1430s. Masaccio, again, who we saw was the master of linear perspective. Let's look at this crucifixion by him. Linear perspective was not his only gift to European painting. He also brought back the art of human anatomy. If we compare with Van Eyck, we see that the modeling of Jesus' body is a lot more sophisticated and precise and more realistic also, as a matter of fact. But on the other hand, there is no landscape. Following a medieval tradition, Masaccio covered the background in gold leaf. This background is non-representational and provides no real-life context. The tribute that we saw a little earlier has a landscape, but we can see that here Masaccio didn't paint this landscape after closely observing nature. It is sketchy at best and probably a product of the painter's imagination. The trees don't look like much either. Fra Angelico is another renowned contemporary Italian artist, and like Masaccio, following the medieval tradition, he used a gold background, which once again, provides no real-life context. Should we conclude that Van Eyck invented the landscape? Probably not, but he certainly started a tradition of naturalistic landscape which was first developed in the Netherlands before it reached the rest of Europe. So what accounts for the difference between those contemporary paintings? Well, the other major difference between those three paintings is the respective medium they use. Masaccio uses fresco on a wall, and Fra Angelico uses egg tempera on wood. Both fresco and egg tempera are water-based paintings that dry very fast and cannot be reworked easily when dry. Fresco and egg tempera are opaque with a matte finish and do not allow much nuances in colors and shade. Even Van Eyck, in his early days as a miniature painter, started with a water-based medium called egg glare, which was made with egg white. This is a page from the Book of Hours of Milano Torino, a manuscript Van Eyck illustrated at about the same time he painted the Metz panel. The similarities with the Metz painting are quite striking. Although the horsemen are departing rather than arriving, they provide depth and distance as they disappear down the hill and reappear and recede towards the city. The strong diagonal of their march creates movement. Again, Van Eyck shows his genius at creating the illusion of third dimension. Just as in the Metz panel, the landscape is divided in two planes, a city and a faraway landscape fading into the distance. With the Milano Torino crucifixion, Van Eyck became the first artist to introduce a true landscape in a religious scene. But you will notice that as beautifully and skillfully constructed as it is, it doesn't have the subtlety of tones that we see in the Met's panel. There isn't a large variety of colors either, and they are pretty saturated. Primary colors plus a green and one or two neutrals, and that's it. By now, I'm certain that you have figured out what accounts for the difference in the colors and styles between Van Eyck's two crucifixions, the manuscript and the panel, and between the Met's Van Eyck and the Masaccio and Fra Angelico. And of course, it is the medium. On the Met panel, Van Eyck paints in oil. A medium that dries slowly, can be reworked, corrected, scraped, painted over, and which mixes easily. And now for the kicker. Oil painting can be thick and opaque, but it can also be diluted to a thin, transparent layer called a glaze. And that meant more colors, more subtlety in the colors, in the shading, the light, and better rendering of the modeling. A wonderful example of Van Eyck's mastery of oil painting is the standing man with a mauve tunique. He created this mauve by first laying down a dark red and then by topping this red with a blue glaze, resulting in that extraordinary moiré mauve tunique. And with glaze, he's also managed to render the different types of folds and textures. In the background, he applies a near-impressionistic touch to render the glittering of nature and the buildings in the sun. And with glazes, he achieves the delicate gradation of colors in the distance. Van Eyck was not the first to paint a landscape, nor was he the first to use oil paint, but he is the genius who realized that painting a landscape or anything else for that matter in oil was the way for art to imitate nature. Van Eyck's handling of oil painting was so innovative that for centuries he was believed to be the inventor of oil painting. Now, art historians agree that although he did not invent the medium, he is the first artist who understood its full potential. And in doing so, he opened the door to such artists as Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. Before we move along, I would like to recap briefly what we have learned so far about Van Eyck, mainly by observing this little oil painting, plus a few comparisons and a smatter of contextual facts. First of all, he was a master of dynamic and expressive composition. He was also a master of empirical perspective. He was the first to introduce a true landscape in a religious painting. He was the first painter to see the full potential of oil painting and introduced his new technique to the Western world. In particular, the glazing technique to add nuances and textures never seen before to colors. In addition to my two previous points, he is the first painter to rely on direct observation of nature, which led him to develop atmospheric perspective and lifelike realism. And I could end this presentation now because if I did, I want to believe that you learned enough to go to a museum or online and look at many more paintings by Van Eyck or by other early North masters, and you would know how to engage with them on your own. But as in most cases in art, there is more to this painting than meets the eye. The main remaining question is why Van Eyck opted for such a strong realism. Why all these details and illusion of textures that seem so totally irrelevant to the main topic of the scene, which is the crucifixion. Oil paint explains how he could achieve such illusions, but it doesn't explain why he chose this painstaking way of painting. In order to answer these questions, we need to push beyond direct observation and look into the historical context. Van Eyck in the 1420s was not using linear perspective, but virtually no Northern Europe painter of his generation did. Contrary to their Italian counterparts, Northern Europe painters remained attached to empirical perspective, which, although not accurate, still gave a sense of space and depth. Linear perspective appeared in the Netherlands the following generation through Italian influences, but it remained sporadic until the 16th century. We should not conclude that Van Eyck and his followers didn't know about linear perspective. Their avoidance was deliberate. 15th century Northern Europe painters' notion of realism did not require the use of linear perspective. Minute realistic details did. In Van Eyck's days, his patrons highly praised him for painting scenes that looked lifelike. He was considered exceptionally talented by his contemporaries in the Netherlands, but also by Italian artists and collectors. There is no doubt that in a pre-camera world, anyone would have been impressed by a painting that looked so close to reality. But when Van Eyck's customers lost themselves in the contemplation of his paintings, they saw a lot more than an aesthetic wonder. These men and women would have been the practitioners of a new form of devotion known as modern devotion. Modern devotion was developed in the 14th century in Northern Europe, and it was a reaction against the established church perceived as corrupt. It encouraged a more personal form of devotion, a more intense personal relationship with the divine. This was to be achieved with techniques of prayers in which the faithful would project themselves into a biblical scene as if they had been there, engaging the protagonists in conversation. This gorgeous painting by Van Eyck is a good illustration of this practice. Chancellor Rollin is in prayer in front of a book of hours or a psalter, and he seems transfixed by the presence of Mary and baby Jesus. From our point of view, he seems to be sharing the space with the mother and child. The three figures are at the same scale and look real. They are close to each other in a small space that emphasizes the proximity of the figures, but at the same time separates them, with a colonnade that opens in good Van Eyck manner into a panoramic view that extends as far as the eye can see. But we should not assume that Chancellor Rollin is having a vision. In this painting, Van Eyck is visualizing the faithful mentally and spiritually projecting himself in Mary and baby Jesus' space in order to partake of all the emotions that may be ascribed to the mother and child. In order to better project themselves in the biblical scene, the faithful were invited to observe paintings featuring that scene and to imagine themselves in that space. They would then engage in a dialogue with the protagonists and share their emotions. To further help the faithful in their meditation, it was important that they be able to feel at home in the painting. Every detail of the painting should look familiar. Hence the introduction of a familiar landscape in the religious painting rather than a gold background. Hence the contemporary costumes, hence the extreme realism in trimmings and textures, hence the realism of the faces who could have been neighbors, hence the strong facial expressions. The faithful were expected to be horrified by the sneers of the crowd and to feel empathy and compassion towards Mary's collapsing in despair, John's pained face, Mary Magdalene's wringing her hands in distress. Van Eyck goes even as far as showing the reflection of two women in the copper shield of the man in mauve. The assumption is that if the shield reflects what is in front of it, the faithful could imagine being right behind the women in this reflection. In other words, it suggests the painting extended all the way to the faithful, and as a result, the faithful would feel included in the scene featured in the painting. This was actually Van Eyck's first try at using a reflection to extend the space of the painting towards the viewer. He did it again in one of his most famous paintings, the Arnolfini couple, painted in 1434. Here, the mirror hanging on the back wall reflects not only the backs of the couple, but also the painter, and behind the painter, an additional onlooker who could be the viewer. Of course, you don't need to be of a specific faith to enjoy Van Eyck's mastery as a painter in any of his biblical scenes. If I did my job right, regardless of your beliefs, you should now have a roadmap to help you engage with 15th century and early 16th century masters. You learned what to look for in the composition and colors, and what question to ask about illusions in space. You also learn that although you can understand a lot by direct visual exploration, some questions cannot be answered only by observing. If you wish to explore further, then you need to find the information. That might be on the label, on the museum's website, and of course in books on the topic. But whether or not you are interested in learning about the historical context in which the painting was created, please first spend time looking. Develop your visual intelligence. Be engaged with art. Thank you for watching, and see you soon in another episode of Engage with